Some people work their entire lives and never get to see the fruits of their labor. They wake up early, go to bed late, sacrifice weekends, miss birthdays, and push through moments where giving up would have been the easier choice. Richard Hargrove was one of those people. Except, unlike most, his sacrifices eventually paid off in a very big way. Richard grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio. His father worked at a hardware store. His mother cleaned offices in the evenings after cooking dinner. There was no family money, no connections, no safety net. What there was, though, was a young boy who watched his parents work themselves to exhaustion and made a quiet promise to himself that one day things would be different. By the time Richard was in his late 20s, he had already made and lost a small fortune in a failed business venture. Most people would have walked away. He didn't. He took what little he had left, moved to New York, slept on a friend's couch for 4 months, and started over. Slowly, deal by deal, decision by decision, he built Hargrove Capital, a real estate and investment company that would eventually stretch across 3 continents and manage assets worth billions of dollars. But here is the thing about men like Richard. The world sees the private jet and the penthouse. They see the tailored suits and the magazine covers. What they don't see is the quiet cost of it all. By the time Richard was in his early 60s, he had everything the world defines as success and almost nothing it defines as happiness. His first marriage had ended years ago, not with a dramatic fight, but with a slow, sad drift apart. His 2 adult children, Daniel and Christine, lived their own lives. They weren't enemies, but they weren't close either. Too many missed school plays. Too many canceled dinners. Too many times work came first. Richard wasn't a cold man. He just didn't quite know how to be present with the people who loved him. He knew how to read a balance sheet. He knew how to spot an opportunity in a struggling market. But sitting still, being soft, letting people in, that was harder for him than any business deal he had ever closed. The one person in his life who truly understood how he worked was his executive secretary, Margaret Ellison. Most people called her Maggie. She had been with him for 14 years. She wasn't just someone who answered his calls and arranged his meetings. She was the quiet engine behind his daily life. She knew which clients he genuinely liked and which ones he only tolerated. She knew when he hadn't eaten, because his mood would shift by mid-afternoon. She knew when a deal was going badly, because he'd start clicking his pen 3 times. Pause 3 times again. Maggie was in her early 50s. Sharp-minded, calm under pressure, and almost invisible in the way that truly competent people often are. She didn't seek attention. She didn't need praise. She just did her job, and she did it better than anyone Richard had ever employed. Over the years, he had been offered bigger roles, more money, and more prestigious positions by other companies. She turned them all down. Richard never really asked her why. Maybe he was afraid of the answer. Or maybe, deep down, he already knew. Now, you might wonder, how does a man worth billions end up in serious trouble? How does someone who has survived cutthroat business deals, hostile takeovers, and economic crashes get blindsided by his own personal life? The honest answer is this. It's because the skills that make someone good at business don't always protect them in matters of the heart. In fact, sometimes those very skills, the confidence, the decisiveness, the willingness to commit fully to something once a decision is made, become the exact thing that gets them into trouble. That's where Vivian came in. Richard met her at a charity gala in Monaco. He had attended reluctantly, the way he attended most social events that weren't tied to work. He didn't enjoy small talk. He didn't enjoy being surrounded by people who wanted something from him. But one of his board members had insisted, and Richard had learned over the years that sometimes you show up even when you don't want to. Vivian was 34 years old. French-born, and the kind of woman who commanded a room without trying to. She had dark eyes, an easy laugh, and a way of making whoever she was talking to feel like the only person in the room. She spoke 4 languages. She could discuss art, wine, architecture, and global economics in the same conversation without missing a beat. For a man like Richard, who had spent decades surrounded by people who wanted deals, not connection, Vivian felt like fresh air. He was careful at first. He was always careful. He asked questions, watched her behavior with others, checked what he could check. Everything seemed genuine. She wasn't flashy about money. She seemed more interested in him, the person, than in his portfolio. She asked him about Ohio, about his parents, about what his first office looked like. Nobody asked Richard Hargrove about Ohio anymore. Within a few months, they were spending weekends together in Paris. Within 6 months, he had introduced her to a small circle of close colleagues. Within 8 months, he was down on one knee. And within a year of meeting her at that gala in Monaco, Richard Hargrove, a man who had survived every storm the business world had ever thrown at him, was a married man again. The wedding was held at a private estate in the south of France. It was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are. Flowers flown in from the Netherlands, a string quartet, champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's weekly grocery bill, 120 guests who all smiled and raised their glasses and said, "What a perfect couple they made." Maggie was there. She sat near the back, dressed neatly, and she smiled when Richard caught her eye across the room. She was genuinely glad to see him happy. That part was real. Richard deserved happiness. He had worked hard enough for it. But Maggie also noticed things that day that she couldn't quite shake. She noticed the way Vivian spoke to the event coordinator, polite in front of Richard, clipped and cold the moment he turned away. She noticed the way Vivian's eyes moved around the room sometimes, not with warmth, but with a kind of quiet calculation. She noticed that Vivian's closest friend at the wedding, a woman named Lisette, spent a good 20 minutes in deep, hushed conversation with a man Maggie didn't recognize, a man who, she would later find out, was a lawyer named Fletcher Ames. Maggie didn't say anything. It wasn't her place. These were small things, impressions. She could be wrong. People have complicated friends. Event coordinators are stressful to deal with. She filed it all away in the back of her mind and flew home the next morning. But the thing about Maggie Ellison was that she never really forgot anything. Back in New York, life at Hargrove Capital continued. Richard came to the office with a lighter energy in those early months of marriage. He smiled more. He left at a reasonable hour sometimes. He even brought Vivian in one afternoon to meet the senior staff. Everyone was charming. Everyone was welcoming. Maggie shook Vivian's hand and said it was wonderful to finally meet her properly. Vivian smiled back and said she had heard so much about her. There was something in the way she said it, not warm, not cold, just measured, like she was sizing up a variable in an equation. Maggie went back to her desk and got back to work. She didn't know it yet. But what was coming would test everything: her loyalty, her instincts, her courage, and her relationship with the man she had quietly dedicated her career to protecting. The easy days were already numbered. And somewhere across town, in an office Maggie had never visited, a man named Fletcher Ames was already drafting the first set of documents. There is a certain kind of person who can walk into a room and immediately understand the unspoken rules of it. Who holds the power? Who is insecure? Who is pretending? Maggie Ellison was that kind of person. She had spent 14 years in close proximity to one of the most high-stakes business environments in the world, and in that time, she had developed a sense for when something was off, even when she couldn't immediately explain why. In the months that followed Richard and Vivian's wedding. That sense started humming quietly in the background of her days. It didn't announce itself loudly. It never does. It started with small things. Little shifts in the atmosphere around Richard that most people wouldn't have noticed, because most people didn't know Richard the way Maggie did. The first thing she noticed was the phone calls. Richard had always been the kind of man who handled his personal finances the same way he handled everything, directly and with full attention. He reviewed his personal account summaries every Monday morning. He had done this for as long as Maggie had known him. Then, about 3 months into the marriage, he stopped. When she placed the folder on his desk one Monday as usual, he waved his hand and said Vivian was helping him manage the personal side of things now. He said it lightly, like it was no big deal. Maggie said nothing. She took the folder back and made a small note. The second thing was the lawyer. Richard had used the same legal counsel for nearly 2 decades. A man named Harold Stern, old school, meticulous, fiercely loyal to Richard's interests. Harold wasn't flashy. He didn't have a fancy office full of young associates running around. He was just very, very good at protecting the people he represented. Vivian had apparently found him boring. She told Richard that for someone of his current status, Harold's firm was too small, too slow, and not connected enough. She recommended Fletcher Ames instead. Richard mentioned this to Maggie casually one morning, asking her to arrange a handover meeting between Harold and the new legal team. Maggie asked, politely, professionally, if she could look into Fletcher Ames' background before setting up the meeting, just to make sure all the credentials were in order. Richard nodded and said sure. Go ahead. What Maggie found was not illegal. Fletcher Ames was a licensed attorney. His paperwork was clean, but his history was thin in ways that bothered her. He had no long-term clients of note. He had moved firms 3 times in 8 years. The clients he did have were mostly based in Europe, and several of them had connections that ran through the same small financial network based out of Luxembourg. Nothing criminal, nothing provable, but the profile of a man who handled serious, long-term wealth? It wasn't there. She wrote up her findings in a brief memo and placed it on Richard's desk. He read it. He thanked her. And then he went ahead with the switch anyway. That was the moment Maggie understood something important. This wasn't going to be a situation where she could simply flag concerns and let Richard make a fully informed choice. Because Richard's judgment, at least in this part of his life, was no longer fully his own. Vivian had gotten to a place inside him that logic couldn't easily reach. Not yet. So Maggie changed her approach. She stopped flagging things directly. Instead, she started documenting them. She kept a personal notebook, not on any company device, not in any shared system. Just a small, plain notebook she kept in her bag. Every time she noticed something that didn't sit right, she wrote it down. Date, time, what was said, who was involved, what the result was. She wasn't building a case yet. She was building a record. Because she had learned over years in business that the truth doesn't always show up all at once. Sometimes it builds slowly, piece by piece. And the only way to see the full picture is to have kept track of all the individual moments. The pattern that emerged over the following weeks was deeply unsettling. Vivian was systematically and very patiently working to move Richard's personal wealth closer to her own control. She did it in ways that were always framed as thoughtful and loving. She wanted them to be true partners, she told Richard. She believed that when 2 people were truly committed to each other, there should be no separation between their financial lives. She said it was something her parents had done, and their marriage had lasted 40 years. Richard, who had spent most of his adult life emotionally armored, found this kind of talk deeply moving. He had married once before and kept everything separate. Maybe that was part of why it hadn't lasted, he thought. Joint accounts were opened. Asset transfers were initiated. Richard signed documents that his new legal team prepared quickly, during busy mornings, often with Vivian present. Always with the framing that this was just housekeeping. Just standard practice for married couples managing shared wealth. Maggie watched all of this from the edges. She was present for the peripheral conversations. She processed some of the administrative paperwork. And with each new development, she added another entry to her notebook. Then came the moment that shifted things from concerning to alarming. Richard's eldest son, Daniel, called the office one afternoon. He and his father hadn't spoken properly in months. Daniel had reached out twice and received short, polite replies. Replies that, Maggie suspected, had been influenced by Vivian's running commentary on Richard's family. Vivian had made several remarks over the months about Daniel being too focused on inheritance, about Christine being emotionally manipulative, about how Richard's children had never truly appreciated him. She said these things gently, with apparent sadness, as though she hated having to say them at all. Richard had started to believe her. Daniel didn't know any of this. He just knew his father felt strangely distant. He called the office because he couldn't get through on Richard's personal phone. Anymore, Vivian answered it most of the time. Maggie took the call. She listened to Daniel, who was confused and clearly hurt. She didn't tell him everything. She wasn't ready to do that yet. But she told him something that would turn out to matter enormously. She said, "Your father is well. He's very busy. But I think he would benefit from seeing you in person soon. If you can find a reason to come to New York, I think you should." Daniel asked if everything was all right. Maggie paused for exactly 1 second and said, "I just think family is important. Especially now." Daniel said he would think about it. Maggie hung up and went back to work. There was also the matter of the will. Richard had an existing will, comprehensive, carefully constructed over many years with Harold Stern's guidance. It made provision for Daniel and Christine. For several long-standing charitable causes Richard had supported for decades, and for a handful of trusted employees, including a quiet provision that Maggie had never discussed with anyone. 3 months into the marriage, Vivian began raising the subject of estate planning. She framed it as being responsible, as thinking ahead, as something every serious couple should address. She found a moment when Richard was relaxed and in a good mood and suggested they sit down with Fletcher Ames to update things too. Reflect the new chapter in their lives. Richard mentioned this to Maggie and asked her to schedule the meeting. She scheduled it. And then she quietly called Harold Stern, who was now officially off the account, and told him, as a professional courtesy, that his former client was in the process of revising his estate planning arrangements with new counsel. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you for letting me know, Maggie." She said, "Of course. I hope things are well with you." That was all. Neither of them said anything more. But Harold Stern, who had known Richard Hargrove for nearly 20 years, put down the phone and sat at his desk for a long time afterward, thinking. Maggie went home that evening, made herself a cup of tea, and opened her notebook. She read back through every entry from the past several months. Then she added a new one. She wrote the date. She wrote what she knew. She wrote what she suspected. And then she wrote one sentence that she underlined twice. It read, "This will not end well unless someone does something." She closed the notebook. She finished her tea. She went to bed, and the next morning she went back to work, because that was what Maggie Ellison did. She showed up. She paid attention. And she waited for the right moment, because she knew better than anyone that acting too soon was just as dangerous as acting too late. That moment was coming. She could feel it. There are moments in life where everything that has been quietly building beneath the surface finally cracks through. where all the small things you chose not to ignore suddenly align into one clear, undeniable picture. For Maggie, that moment came on a Tuesday in November. Just after 9 in the morning, Richard was scheduled to fly to Dubai later that afternoon for a 3-day business conference. It was a big trip, several major meetings lined up, a keynote appearance, and a dinner with a group of sovereign wealth fund representatives he had been trying to get in front of for the better part of a year. He was focused on it. His mind was already half in the UAE. He had asked Maggie the previous day to prepare his travel folder, a standard set of documents he liked to review on the plane. Business briefs, agenda details, a summary of the key players he'd be meeting. He also mentioned there were a few documents Vivian's assistant had sent over to be included. Routine matters, he said. Just some personal paperwork that needed his signature before the end of the month. Nothing urgent. He hadn't reviewed them yet. That last sentence is the one that mattered. He hadn't reviewed them. Maggie went through the full folder that morning, the way she always did, methodically, page by page, making sure everything was in order and correctly labeled before it landed in Richard's hands. She trusted no detail too small to check. It was just how she worked. She was 3/4 of the way through the stack when she stopped. The document in front of her was 12 pages long. It was written in the dense, technical language that legal documents always use, the kind of language designed to make the average person skim rather than read. But Maggie wasn't the average person. She had spent 14 years processing legal and financial documents on Richard's behalf. She knew how to read them. What she was holding was a power of attorney document, broad, comprehensive, and structured in a way that would give Vivian near total authority over Richard's personal and business assets in the event of his. And here the document used carefully chosen language: extended absence, incapacitation, or inability to manage affairs in a timely manner. It had been drafted by Fletcher Ames. Richard had not mentioned it. There had been no conversation about it, no briefing, no context provided. It had simply been slipped into a stack of paperwork destined for a man who was distracted, travel-ready, and inclined to trust his wife. Maggie set the document down on her desk. She placed her hands flat on either side of it. She took one slow breath, and then she moved. She walked into Richard's office and told him calmly that there was a clerical issue with one of the documents in his folder, a formatting inconsistency that needed to be verified before anything was signed. She said it would take about 30 minutes to sort out. She was sorry for the delay. Richard looked up from his phone, slightly impatient, and said that was fine. He told her to get it sorted and let him know when the folder was ready. Maggie walked back out, closed the door quietly behind her, and went straight to her desk phone. She called Daniel. She had one chance to get this right, and she knew it. She didn't have time for a long explanation. She told Daniel that she needed him at the office immediately, that there was something regarding his father that required his presence in person today. Before Richard left for Dubai, she told him this was not something she could explain over the phone. She told him to come now. Daniel, to his enormous credit, didn't ask a lot of questions. He got in a car. Then Maggie did something she had been thinking about for weeks. She called Harold Stern. She told him what she had found in the folder. She read him the key language from the power of attorney document over the phone. There was a silence on Harold's end that lasted several seconds. Then he said he could be available for a video call within the hour, and that Maggie should make absolutely sure that document did not get signed under any circumstances before he spoke with Richard directly. Maggie said she understood. When Daniel arrived 40 minutes later, he went straight up to the office. Maggie met him in the corridor, handed him a brief handwritten summary of what she had observed over the past several months. Not everything, just the key points, and told him that his father needed to hear from his son today, not as a confrontation, but as a presence. She said Richard needed to feel that his family was real and close before he walked into the conversation. She was about to arrange Daniel read the summary. His expression shifted from concern to something quieter and more serious. He nodded. Maggie set up the private conference room. She got Richard out of his office under the pretext that there was an urgent pre-departure matter requiring his attention. She sat him down. She placed the power of attorney document in front of him. And then she called Harold Stern on screen. What followed was one of the most difficult conversations Richard Hargrove had ever sat through. Harold walked him through the document with the patience and precision of a man who had spent a lifetime doing exactly this kind of work. He explained what the language meant in plain terms. He explained what it would allow Vivian to do, not theoretically, but practically. He walked through specific scenarios. He was not dramatic about it. He was simply clear. Richard didn't speak for most of it. He sat very still, which was unlike him. His hands were flat on the table, and he stared at the document like he was trying to remember signing something like this before. He couldn't, because he never had. When Harold finished, Richard asked one question. He asked when this had been prepared. Harold told him the document had likely been in preparation for several weeks, based on the drafting conventions used. Richard asked Daniel to leave the room for a few minutes. Daniel stepped out. Maggie moved to follow, but Richard said, "Stay." She stayed. He sat quietly for almost a full minute. Then he said he wanted a full audit, not a routine review, a forensic one. Every personal account, every transfer, every document he had signed in the last 18 months. He said he wanted Harold back on the account, effective immediately. He said he was not getting on a plane today. He said all of this in a steady, flat voice. Not angry yet. Just decided. The audit took 11 days. What it found was, in some ways, worse than Maggie had feared, though perhaps not more than she had suspected. Over 18 months, a series of transfers totaling $4.3 million had moved from Richard's personal accounts into 2 offshore structures that traced back to accounts connected to Vivian and Fletcher Ames. The authorization signatures on the transfer instructions were Richard's, or appeared to be. A handwriting analyst was brought in. The findings raised serious doubts about several of them. The paper trail was meticulous in one way and careless in another. Meticulous in the sense that it had been carefully constructed to look routine. Careless in the sense that the people behind it had apparently believed Richard would never look closely enough to see it. They had factored in Richard's trust. They had factored in his distraction. They had factored in his emotional investment in the marriage. They had not factored in Maggie. When Richard sat across from Vivian and her legal team with Harold and the audit findings on the table, the meeting was brief. Vivian did not collapse into denial. She did not cry. She looked at the documents for a moment and then looked at Richard with an expression it was almost impossible to read. And she said, quietly, "You would have never noticed." Richard held her gaze and said nothing, because the truth, the painful, complicated truth, was that she was probably right. He wouldn't have noticed. Not on his own. He had been too close to it, too trusting, too willing to believe that what he felt was real, because he had wanted it to be real for so long. But someone had noticed. Someone who sat 3 offices down from him every day and never once stopped paying attention, even when it would have been far easier to do exactly that. The legal process was already in motion. Fletcher Ames had been contacted by the State Bar. Transfers were being traced and frozen. Richard's family was on their way to New York, and somewhere in all of it, Maggie Ellison was back at her desk, answering emails and rescheduling the Dubai meetings, doing what she always did, her job. When something like this happens to a person, when they discover that someone they loved and trusted was never quite who they believed them to be, there is a grief in it that most people don't talk about. It isn't the same as losing someone to illness or time. It's a different, sharper kind of loss. Because you're not just losing the person, you're losing the version of the story you had been telling yourself. And that can be surprisingly hard to let go of. Even when the facts are right there in front of you. Richard Hargrove spent the first few days after the audit findings in a state that people close to him described as very quiet. Not broken, not visibly distressed, just quiet in a way that was different from his usual focused silence. He went to the office. He took meetings. He reviewed the documents Harold's team placed in front of him. But there was a stillness around him that hadn't been there before. His daughter, Christine, flew in from London the day after she found out. She had not been close to her father in recent years, but blood has a way of cutting through distance when it matters. She arrived at his apartment, and by all accounts, the two of them sat together for several hours just talking, not about the legal situation, not about Vivian, but about ordinary things. Old memories. The kind of conversations they hadn't had in far too long. Daniel was already in New York. He had barely left since that Tuesday morning when Maggie called him. He had taken meetings with Harold's team, reviewed some of the audit findings at Richard's request, and positioned himself as a quiet, steady presence in his father's corner. The distance between them, built up over years of missed moments and poor priorities, didn't disappear overnight. But it began to soften. That, too, was part of what this situation had cracked open. Not just the fraud, but the relationships that had been quietly calcifying under the weight of a busy and emotionally armored life. The divorce proceedings began formally within weeks. Vivian's legal team came in prepared. They pointed to the joint asset agreements that had been structured during the marriage and argued for a significant share of those holdings. They used language about partnership and mutual contribution and the reasonable expectations of a spouse. Harold Stern, who was back at the helm of Richard's personal legal affairs and clearly energized by the work, dismantled those arguments methodically. The forensic audit provided the foundation. The handwriting analysis raised serious questions about the legitimacy of several key document signatures. The offshore transfer records, once fully traced and documented, painted a picture that was very difficult to argue against in good faith. Fletcher Ames, who had been the legal architect of much of what had happened, was facing his own serious problems. A formal ethics complaint had been filed with the state bar. A civil claim was being prepared. He had quietly stopped returning calls from Vivian's team about 2 weeks into the proceedings, which told its own story. The divorce itself was settled without going to full trial. Vivian's team, facing the weight of the evidence and the very real prospect of the situation becoming significantly more complicated, agreed to a settlement. The terms were not made public. What is known is that Vivian received considerably less than she had invested 18 months of her life trying to obtain. There were conditions attached that restricted further claims. She signed, and within a short period, she had left the country. The $4.3 million that had been transferred offshore was substantially recovered. Not every cent. These things are rarely perfectly clean, but enough that the financial damage was significantly contained. The accounts were closed. The structures Ames had built were unwound. Richard stood in Harold's office on the afternoon after the final settlement documents were signed. He didn't celebrate. He didn't express relief in any dramatic way. He just stood at the window for a moment and then said he wanted to review the internal protocols at Hargrove Capital, specifically around document handling and authorization procedures for his personal affairs. Harold told him that was probably a very wise idea. Richard nodded. And then he went back to work, because that is what he had always done. But there was one more thing he needed to do first. He went to Maggie's office, not his own, hers, and he sat down across from her desk. This was unusual enough that Maggie looked up from her screen with a slight expression of surprise. Richard almost never sat in her office. It was usually the other way around. He said he owed her more than he knew how to properly express. He said he had thought about it quite a bit over the past several weeks and still hadn't found the right words. He asked her, plainly, why she hadn't come to him earlier, in those first months, when she started noticing things. Why she had waited. Maggie considered the question for a moment. Then she said something that Richard would think about for a long time afterward. She said, "Because you weren't ready to hear it. If I had come to you 3 months into your marriage and told you I had concerns about Vivian, you would have listened politely and then decided I was being overprotective. Maybe you would have started to feel like I didn't want you to be happy. And then you would have started shutting me out, the same way you were shutting out Daniel and Christine. I needed you to be in a position where you could actually see it clearly. That takes time. So I waited, and I kept watch, and I made sure that when the moment came, I had everything you needed to see the full picture." Richard was quiet for a bit. Then he said, "That required a lot of patience." Maggie said, "You've always required a lot of patience." It was the closest thing to a joke either of them had exchanged in weeks. And Richard actually laughed. A short, real laugh, which felt like something returning to the room. In the weeks and months that followed, several things changed at Hargrove Capital. A formal internal compliance review was conducted on all personal authorization processes. Any document requiring Richard's personal signature now went through a 2-step verification process that couldn't be bypassed, regardless of who requested the expedited timeline. Harold Stern was formally reinstated as Richard's sole personal legal counsel, with a clear protocol that no transitions of off that kind could happen without Harold's knowledge and documented consent. Richard also quietly revised his will. The new version reflected his actual wishes, his children, his long-standing charitable commitments, the people who had genuinely been part of his life. It was built carefully, without pressure, with Harold's guidance and Richard's full attention. He and Daniel had dinner together once a week for the next 3 months. Sometimes Christine joined by video from London. It wasn't perfect. 14 years of emotional distance doesn't dissolve in a season. But it was real, and it was consistent, and that was something that hadn't existed before. Maggie's compensation was adjusted significantly. Richard didn't make a formal announcement about it. That wasn't his style, and it certainly wasn't hers. It was handled quietly, as most things between them were handled. She received a written commendation from Richard as well, a private letter, hand-signed, that described in specific terms what she had done and what it had meant. She kept it at home, not at the office. She was not the kind of person who displayed things like that where others could see them. She never gave an interview. She never told the story to anyone outside the small circle of people who had been directly involved. When colleagues at the firm asked vaguely what had happened with Richard's personal situation, she said it had been a difficult period, but that things were resolved now. And then she changed the subject. There is a version of this story where Maggie Ellison is celebrated loudly, where she gets the credit she deserved in some public, visible way, where people know her name and understand what she did. That version didn't happen. And honestly, knowing Maggie, she probably preferred it that way. What did happen was this: a man who had built an enormous amount of wealth and lost nearly all of his personal happiness along the way got a second chance, not just to protect what he had built, but to rebuild some of the things that mattered far more: his relationship with his children, his trust in the right people, his ability to be honest about what he needed and who he actually was outside of a boardroom. None of that would have happened without. The person who sat 3 offices down and paid attention, when it would have been much easier not. To loyalty is a word that gets used loosely. People talk about it often and practice it less. But real loyalty, the kind that stays quiet when staying quiet is harder than speaking. The kind that protects someone even from their own blind spots. The kind that keeps records and makes calls and shows up on a Tuesday morning when everything is on the line. That kind of loyalty is genuinely rare. Richard Hargrove was, in the end, one of the lucky ones. Not because he was wealthy. Wealthy people get taken advantage of all the time. And most of them never even find out. He was lucky because for 14 years, the right person had been paying attention. And when it mattered most, she didn't look the other way.